Secretary Madeleine Albright, real honor to have you on How to Fix Democracy. To begin, let's take your view of the overall health of democracy in the early part of the 21st century. Are you worried if you were a doctor?
First of all, I'm delighted to be able to do this, but I am worried because I so believe that we are all the same and we want to be able to make decisions about our own lives, and the only way to do that is through democracy. And I think that according to the statistics, there are fewer democracies at the moment, and that democracies are under stress. And I think we do need to figure out, as we do the diagnosis, what really are the problems that are making it difficult for democracy at the moment to really be predominant, which I think would make for a better world.
We're here in Kansas City. You're holding your annual forum of ex-foreign ministers. Why did you choose to have your annual conference here? Is there something symbolic?
Well, many parts. I think that this is the 70th anniversary of NATO and the 20th anniversary of when the Czechs, the Poles, and the Hungarians were brought into NATO. I'm the one that signed the papers for that. I was not born, as we talked about, I was not born in the United States. Harry Truman was my first American president. I came here in November 1948. And we're here because of the Truman Library and the Truman tradition in Kansas and Kansas City, Missouri, independence and various parts, and also because Kansas, Harry Truman was the most kind of average and yet remarkable American, somebody who had a lot of common sense, had roots in the middle of America, fought for America, and was a realistic idealist in terms of the kinds of things and the institutions that he established or helped establish once he had become president. So there's something about being in the center of the country, honoring a president who really established a lot of the institutions whereby most of the former foreign ministers that we all operated under, whether it was the United Nations or the establishment of NATO, the fact that the United States saw a necessity for having a national interest foreign policy that helped other countries, that wasn't just selfish and didn't see America as a victim, but saw America as a leader for democracy and helping those that didn't have it.
Are you concerned at all about the resentment against coastal elites, both West and East Coast elites, that's been manifested in states like Kansas and Missouri? We're in Kansas City now, which is half in Missouri and Kansas. Is there a need, in other words, to reform capitalism if we're going to fix democracy?
Well, I think that what is troubling is that, by the way, when we came to the United States in the late 40s,
when you say we, you
and my family,
yeah, from Czechoslovakia.
Yes, this really was a very middle-class country. And very different in some ways from Europe, where there was always kind of the intellectual elite. And I remember my father being very surprised that his students would go out and wait on tables or help people at the gas station, that European students wouldn't have done that. So I think that democracy is based on the fact that all people have an opportunity and that we help each other. The social contract is based on helping each other. And what has happened now, and I don't think it's just East Coast elites, is the kind of 1% of people who are making money, who get a lot of the tax breaks, and there's not enough recognition of our responsibilities to each other to help those who can't help themselves. And so there really is something about what we talk about as the 1%. Which is anti-democratic. But I believe in capitalism, but capitalism has to be generous and understand that you can't just have a group of people that never think about what's happened to those that don't have everything.
In your last book, a best-selling book, Fascism, your mood is, I thought at least, quite dark. It's a brilliant book, but you suggest that we're sliding back into fascism.
Well, the book is called Fascism, a Warning, and there are some people who think it's alarming. It's supposed to be alarming, because I am concerned about certain aspects of fascism that seem to be reappearing. I decided in my book that it was important to take a historical look at fascism. Mussolini was the first fascist, and he came into power in Italy after the end of World War I. Italy had fought on the side of the Allies, but there were issues in terms of the economy, how the government should be run, and all of a sudden, this outsider, Benito Mussolini, who was a very good speaker and a gatherer of people, comes into view because he was able to motivate people and then divide people. Fascism is very hard to define. It's not an ideology, it's a process for taking power. And Mussolini was somebody, and this is the part that I wanted to make very clear in the book. Mussolini and Hitler came into power by constitutional means. In Italy, King Emmanuel, who was weak, turned power over to Mussolini, and Mussolini took advantage of it. The best quote in the book actually comes from Mussolini, and it is, "If you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices." And so I am calling out the plucking of feathers in a variety of places now, modern, in Hungary, for instance, and Turkey, the Philippines, Venezuela, Brazil, and really a way where a leader aligns himself with one group of people at the expense of another, and then blames the other for everything, the scapegoat. I'm very troubled by what is going on with the immigrants, where all of a sudden they seem to be the ones being blamed for a variety of problems. Then a leader who thinks he's above the law and also makes clear that the press is the enemy of the people. I think that one of the aspects of fascism that I think is dispositive in many ways, and obviously not true in the United States, is the use of violence to get control. I do think, however, that there are elements that I call out as the feathers, and that we cannot be in a position where we think that a leader can be above the law, and where instead of regarding the press as the basis of a free country, of a democracy, to call out the press as the enemy of the people. And then this business of really, there are problems in our societies, there's no question, and we can talk more about what they're about, a lot to do with technology and how people have been displaced from their jobs, and questions about health programs and tuition for young people in schools. But what is needed at times like that is a leader who can find common answers, not one who exacerbates the problem and sets one group against another. And so that's why I thought it was important to write the book as a warning to watch out for the feathers.
What did you most learn about fascism that you didn't know from the research for this book? What woke you up? I mean, I assume you had some sort of instincts when you took on the book project, but what did you most learn about fascism that you were unaware of before you wrote the book?
Well, first of all, a lot of it is personal, because as a result of fascism and the Nazis coming into the country of my birth, Czechoslovakia, we had to escape. We were refugees and spent the war in England, and then came back after World War II, and then had to leave again when the communists took over. So I think the thing that I did learn is that divisions in society can be made worse by a fascist leader, and then if there are simple answers to problems, or stated that way, then there are some who are attracted to that, who think, okay, if there's an answer to whatever is going on in terms of job loss or various problems that afflict society, let's go there. Because democracy is, as I said, the desire of most people in many ways. They want to make decisions about their own lives. But getting to democracy is quite a long process, and it has some messy and difficult periods to it.
Social media, of course, has been very important in the eruption of democratic feeling, particularly in the Arab Spring, the Occupy movement, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter. But some people believe also that social media is compounding division. It's contributing to our failure to talk to one another. It's creating an echo chamber culture. How do you interpret the role of social media in today's crisis of democracy? Is it the problem or the solution, or both?
Well, it's interesting because I think initially those of us that have studied democracy and social media or information technology thought it was going to be very democratizing, that it would allow people to have free access to information, also be able to talk to each other in that particular way. I think it's turned out to be very much a double-edged sword because the input is unclear. There are those who use it for their own purposes with propaganda and false information. It also disaggregates voices. In order to have democracy, I think you do need either political parties or organizations that can be a force multiplier of people's desires for freedom. And so what's happened is at the moment I think we have the downside of this incredible gift, because in so many ways it is, and then people are getting their information from their own, it's an echo chamber, and they are not trying to find common answers.
Do you have opportunities to debate with people you may disagree with?
Well, I don't do it on social media because I think that in many ways can be misinterpreted. But it's interesting because you were very kind to talk about my book. What has happened as I've gone around talking about what I'm trying to explain in my book, I say, we all know this saying, see something, say something. I've added to that, do something. And among the things that I call for is for people to talk to each other, and especially people with whom you disagree. I don't particularly like the word tolerance because that's tolerate, put up with. I think it's more important to respect what other people are thinking, but really requires having sustained discussions with them. And I don't think we're doing enough of that. And I think the problem with social media is that it's too instantaneous. It doesn't really allow, I think, for sequential conversations and really having a possibility of look into their eyes and try to figure out what people are really thinking and saying.
So one way to fix democracy is to look into the eyes of someone you may not agree with, but at least they are able to sit down with and have a civil conversation.
Absolutely, I think so. The other part that I think truly has happened is that people are so wedded to whatever instrument they have that they don't even look up as they're about to cross the street. Everybody is into their own thing, and that doesn't work for functional societies. Societies and democracies depend on interaction. And the part that I think is very interesting, I used to study the role of information in political change, especially communism. The idea of communism was to keep people in their vertical slots and not have any horizontal communication so that different groups could talk to each other.
Do you think communism would have ended differently if there'd been social media around?
Well, I studied this, by the way.
That's why I'm asking you.
Well, first of all, I'd written, and if I may answer this from a different angle also, I did my dissertation on the role of the Czechoslovak press during the Prague Spring in 1968. And that had been a controlled press. And slowly but surely, what happened was the press freed itself. It became uncensored and began to question a lot of the things that had happened under communism. I happen to think that it was instrumental in some of the political change, so instrumental that in fact that is one of the reasons that the Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviets, invaded Czechoslovakia, and the role of the media then. So I decided I wanted to study the Solidarity Press. And what was very interesting about that, and it all does sound very old-fashioned at this point, people did in fact communicate some before through mimeograph machines or samizdat or various ways but they also listened to Radio Free Europe or Voice of America. So the people knew a lot of what was true, but the question was, would it ever appear in newspapers? And slowly but surely it began to, and the Solidarity Press had a very big influence on what was going on. And also another vehicle, which was the cassette. That was the new instrument.
That, that's coming back into fashion, the cassette.
Yeah, but it was very funny because what would happen was Lech Wałęsa would give a speech at some factory, and then they could send the cassette to another one, and it kind of spread the news. And the reason, I think, that martial law was imposed did have to do with the fact that the workers had information and were beginning to really question what the Communist Party was doing. So yes, I think it does become, the press is not the enemy of the people, the press is the enemy of authoritarian and dictatorial governments.
As a keen observer of East Central Europe, you've already mentioned Orban and the crisis of democracy in Hungary. I assume you have some reservations also about what's happening in Poland. But the Democrats are fighting back in Eastern Europe, particularly in Slovakia. Are there reasons to be cheerful about democracy in East Central Europe?
Yes, I think. By the way, I was just in Poland, and I went to one of the newspapers, and they were fighting for the Constitution. In fact, they gave me a pin that said Konstytucja, but I do think that the press there, some parts of it, are trying to play a role in questioning what is going on. Also, what I find interesting is what did just happen in Slovakia. There's a new woman president who was fighting against corruption, but also about the fact that it was a journalist who had been doing some investigative reporting who was murdered, and she talked about that it obviously was illegal and can't happen again, which I think is one of the reasons that she won her election. There are even some reports of people disagreeing with what Orban is doing, and so I do think there's some pushback from some areas. The problem is that the Russians are the ones who now are also militarizing or weaponizing information. And they are using information to undermine whatever is going on anywhere. Russia is run by a KGB agent, and he certainly knows about propaganda. And so he is capable of directing the Russians to undermine the democratic processes in all these countries by using information against the people.
Do you think the Russians corrupted the last election in the United States?
I do think so. I think that they were able to use some of their tactics, but I also think that some of the things that are going on now, not just in the United States but in Central and Eastern Europe, could be a dress rehearsal for 2020, which is why I think it is very important for
2020, the
elections
US, the
in the U.S.
election.
In order to really get at this, is that the U.S. government has to make clear that what happened in the 2016 election and some evidence even in 2018 can't happen again, and that I happen to think it's time, I think we need to be clear that President Trump was elected legally by the Electoral College, and we need to get away from that and start talking about what the Russians were doing and try to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
The social contract is broken. It's been shattered in some ways, as you suggested. Might it require a woman to fix it? I know you have some strong feelings about women in politics. You were the first female Secretary of State. You've made remarks about the relationship between democracy and women. Might we need a president, a female president in the United States?
I think it would be good to have a female president who had empathy for others. And there is something about empathy that I think women have a lot of, but of course there are a lot of men that do too. So I am for somebody that wants to solve the problems, that wants to listen to people, that understands that democracy is a two-way street, and that you can't just have people support you and then not do anything for them. That also, I want a leader that will try to find common answers and not make divisions.
Does that have to be a Democrat, do you think? Or could the Republicans come up with somebody like that?
They could, they haven't. But no, I am a Democrat. I have been a Democrat since I first came to the United States because of Harry Truman. But I also do think that I'm not an elitist. I think that the Republicans, and I'm not a conservative, I am basically a centrist with left leanings, but definitely a centrist.
What about the role of education in strengthening democracy? I know you're involved in a number of initiatives through through your foundation to strengthen democracy. Is that another of the problems, that people don't understand what democracy is, that they need different kinds of education?
I think education is one of the issues in terms of where there's not enough teaching these days about civics, as we call it. You know, what is government about? Why do people need a government? What is the role of the government? In the United States, I think it's very important for people to understand what it says in the Constitution. And specifically, the American Constitution is based on the fact that we didn't want a king or a one leader where everybody kind of just salutes and does what they obeys. The first article of the American Constitution is about the power of Congress and Congress's oversight, and the role and how the executive and legislative and judicial branch work together. I also think that education, because one of the problems that have created some of the discomfort these days is technology, and whether people are trained for the jobs that are out there. And so what kind of training people have, how do they remain flexible in terms of learning, kind of ongoing learning, what is really useful. But one of the problems that people point to is that there is a lacking in not so much in college education, but in some of the secondary education. And then there's a whole question as to what people get out of college. Does everybody go to college? Should we be doing more? The Germans are really the ones that are the experts in apprenticeships. Shouldn't there be some other way of looking at how people work? And by the way, one of the interesting things, I was very proud when Václav Havel became president of the Czech Republic because of his morality and his philosophical approach to things. And one of the things he said is that there's so much dignity in work, and if people get too separated from the product they are producing, they don't feel that dignity of work. And I think that we need to figure out where people get their dignity, what gives people a chance to understand who they are, what their responsibilities are. And so work and how one identifies is very important.
So you must be particularly concerned with the potential impact of AI on labor.
Absolutely. I think there's a real question about how that works. And we do have time to we need to have very serious discussions about where we're going as societies in terms of how people relate to each other, which is to go back to something I said earlier. We need to talk to each other. We need to understand the changes. We need to, and I'm very glad that the political season in the U.S. has begun so early, because there are so many issues that need to be talked about.
Finally, Secretary Albright, the great debate in the 20th century, which you're as familiar as anyone with, both personally and intellectually, was the debate between rival systems of government and economy, the Soviet system versus the Western system. What is the great debate in the 21st century? Is it between Western democracy and the Chinese system, or is it something more existential, something bound up with technology? What is going to define the issues at the core of freedom in the 21st century?
I think this is one of the big issues because we don't know and we're disagreeing on it. But I think that what is a defining aspect is that the 20th century and the century before that was based on the system of the nation state and people identifying themselves with the country where they lived, and a sense that there was some kind of system within them, either democratic or monarchical or something. What is different now is that there are non-state actors that are very important players also, and those are businesses and NGOs and various groupings. But at the same time, there are problems that need to be handled by more than one stakeholder, whether it's a nation or a private business, that they're multilateral. And so they need cooperation across the board. I think the biggest threat really is climate change because it affects everybody and it can only be dealt with by cooperation. Or the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, again, that have to be handled multilaterally. Or the spread of disease that have to be handled multilaterally. Those are things that know no borders. So we have very basic questions to deal with that in previous centuries have been dealt with either because there were kings or later trying to figure out how democratic governments existed, borders. But we are now a multinational, multilateral, and it doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out that you have to develop tools that are able to be used across borders that deal with much larger problems. And so I think we're in a very different century, and the institutions which we have now are not dealing with it. And so one of the reasons that we are here are exactly these issues that we're trying to talk about. Those of us that have had experience in dealing with 20th century institutions, do we have the imagination and the intellectual capabilities of dealing with an entirely new set of problems using the experience that we have of respect for each other and working with each other?
So institutions need to catch up with the world.
No question. And I've said a lot that institutions and people at age 70 need a little refurbishing. So we are here doing a little refurbishing.